Hi everyone, this is Maureen Bilhakamari of Baking with Amari, formerly Amari Baking Center. We have now rebranded. So in today's video, what I want to do is share some tips for sponge cake making, and this is geared towards beginners or just anybody who's been baking other things and now wants to really perfect their sponge cake making. So basically, that's what I'll be discussing today. So just to get right into my presentation, this is Baking with Amari in case this is your first time watching this video. And in this channel, basically what we share is baking tips, cake decoration tutorials, and other stuff. Sorry, I have a bit of an echo, so I'm just gonna pause for a minute. Okay, so I have a presentation for today, and what I've done is just basically moved ahead of time, but I'm back on track. So, if you're joining me live, by the way, say hi, hit them love bubbles, leave a comment, and do let me know if this, helps you out in any way. Now, this is specifically for anybody who has tried sponge cake once, failed, and just given up. Or, there's a lot of people who are just afraid of sponge cakes because they just figure that it's going to be a nightmare. This is definitely going to be for you because this is going to help you conquer your fear. That's basically what I'm sharing today. So, today is all about sponge cakes, okay? Now, before I talk about sponge cakes, I always love giving an introduction. And so, I'm about to give you an introduction that will help you as a baker understand my final points or my actual points, right? So, how long does it take to learn a skill? And by the way, when you're a baker, this is everything, right? Because you might learn how to do butter cakes, and then you're like, oh, I want to learn something else. Every time you want to learn a specific skill, you do have to take time to learn the thing. So basically, scientists say, or experts say, that it takes about 12 to 20 hours just to learn something. This is just to learn something, right? So it takes 12 to 20 hours to learn something, right? And then once you learn the thing, how long does it take to develop this skill, right? Of course, it depends on how passionate you are about this skill, that you are about learning it. But basically, once you learn the skill, it takes 6 to 8 months with constant and consistent practice to develop the skill. So in this case, it could be like 4 hours a day, 3 to 5 days a week. If you are really dedicated, you can do it like longer or more times, right? So basically, it takes 6 to 8 months to develop a skill. Then, if you really want to master, now not everybody masters everything. Like I haven't mastered every skill. I might choose to master like something like sponge cakes and butter cakes, but I haven't mastered everything, right? So you don't have to master every skill that you learn. But if you want to be a master at a skill, you have to work on that skill 10,000 hours. So this is learning, developing, and then actual doing of the thing, right? Doing like practicing the sponge cakes and all that. So it takes 10,000 hours to master that skill. All right. So if you were to look at what is, 10,000 hours, it's roughly 9 to 10 years, right? So this means like you're working on this skill 5 days a week, 4 hours each day, right? So if you've been doing this for a while, like if you've been baking for a while, like I have, you can start mastering a specific skill, right? So what does this mean for you, right? Why am I summarizing this for you? For any baker to learn, you need at least 12 to 20 hours of learning sponge cake making. And this is usually guided learning. Guided means somebody who's a professional, somebody who's experienced, preferably a professional baker, right? This means that the person teaching you has to have years of practice and experience, as well as a proper grasp of the techniques that when you're going wrong or things are going wrong, you know how to troubleshoot. Now, if you're not able to do in person class, the next best thing will be like an ebook or an online class that somebody has put together. Okay. So I just wanted to give that introduction. I say this because a lot of people tend to have a very big expectation of themselves. And then when they fail the first time, they give up. But remember, you have to learn, then you have to develop, and you have to continue to actually master the thing. So be patient with yourself, but also realize that it's going to take practice for you to perfect a certain skill, right? So just know that. Now, today I'm going to share tips that you need to know when it comes to sponge cake making so that you can be a better baker of sponge cakes and maybe even perfect them over time. So, the first tip I want to share with people, you need to know this about baking. Baking is a science. I say this because people think it's like cooking. Like if I say 500 grams of flour, you can add 600. No, guys, it is a science. So you have to do things properly. You need to use proper temperature in your oven, and you need a good dry heat source. I say a good dry heat source because I don't want to say a good oven, because I know, like, if you're in Kenya, you know there's something called mawe tatu, or if you have informal ovens, like we use charcoal ovens, there's people who use stone hearths. There's different ways you can bake. Now, of course, the best is having a commercial oven or a home appliance oven, but you also want to make sure whatever dry heat source you have is a good one, because if it's not a good one, it's not going to give you the result, right? If you've ever dealt with us with our ebooks and if you share some tips, like troubleshooting tips, we ask you so many questions before we answer, because it could be your oven, it could be so many things, which leads to my second point when it comes to sponge cake making. In order for a baker to get good results each time for your sponge cakes, you have to have proper tools and proper technique. And when it comes to sponge cake making, this is not a suggestion. This is actually the truth. So for tools, you need proper measuring tools for accurate ingredients. You need proper mixing tools so that you can get the best result for your sponge cake. And you need to make sure you have the best baking tools. That's your oven or pans to hold your cake mixture. You have to make sure they're a good quality thing, especially especially when it comes to measuring. You need to make sure you have a weighing scale. Now, cups and spoons are good, but if you want accuracy, guys, you need um, a very good kitchen skill. And you can still have the measuring cups and spoons because you'll need to be using like a teaspoon or something like that. Then this is a must. Whether you have a home appliance, a commercial oven, whatever it is you have, you need a high temperature thermometer, guys. General other cakes like butter cakes, generally, I won't even worry about it. But when it comes to sponge cake making, temperature is so big. So you need to make sure you're hanging your your high temperature thermometer there so you can know your internal temperature. And then it's also good to have a timer so that you can keep track of what's happening. Most beginners or amateurs don't know that this is where they're getting it wrong. You can get bad results just from measuring things the wrong way. The other thing is that you need at least a whisk, a sieve, and a spatula or mixer if you can, right? Because when you're mixing, technique is important, and especially when your technique is going with good equipment as well. The third tip you need to know, this is crucial, this is important. Proper sponge cake making techniques are the answer. Like I think they're like the end all be all when it comes to mixing your sponge cake. This will make or break your sponge cake results. So if you don't know these things, you need to learn and practice them correctly so that you can get a good result. Why? When you're baking, the baking process goes like this. Once you mix your batter, your sponge cake batter, you place it into your preheated oven, right? When you do that, if you have mixed correctly, right? You're gonna bake a very good cake. It's gonna come out properly, it's gonna come out the way it should, it's gonna rise nicely. However, if you do not have the right correct mixture, you're not gonna get a good result, guys. It's not gonna have a good taste. It's not gonna have a good color for the sponge cake. So it is important to make sure that you know proper techniques. Hi, Helen. I see you have joined me. You're not a beginner, but you love tuning in because there's always something to learn. Thank you so much, Helen. I am glad to hear that and glad to bring some value over here. And so, yeah, you're right. You were always learning. I'm always learning all the time, even if it's like beginner content sometimes. So don't you worry, you're in the right place. And thanks for the comment. So again, master your technique so that you can get good results like these. Now, I don't want to tell people you're going to start today and you're going to get this results. No, you're not. But over time and perfection of technique, you're going to get even better results than this, which is what you want when it comes to your sponge cakes. My third tip for sponge cake making, sorry, still on the sponge cake making, please learn how to whisk and fold properly. right? Whisking, you want to check a particular way. So if you like have our ebook, there's a particular method you're supposed to be checking. And folding has like three methods of folding. There's the number 8, there's the over and under. Some people use the S method. There's different types of folding methods. So you need to make sure whatever it is you're supposed to be using, you use it. I love showing this image because this is an image of genoise, as I heard. I've been pronouncing it wrong. On the left is a genoise, and then the other one is like a really nice and fluffy sponge cake. I believe that's an angel food cake. The one sponge cake deflated, and I kept it so I can take photos to show you the difference between when a technique goes wrong. So you want to make sure that you're getting things right, because look at the difference between the height and the texture of these two cakes. This is literally from bad technique on one cake. So you definitely want to make sure you're doing that. And if you're wondering where to get sponge cake recipes that are help, we do have a new ebook, Sponge Cake Making Insights Techniques, very in-depth. I like went in-depth on this. The science, the technique, everything. There is tons of content. So if you haven't gotten it yet, you need to get it. And there's 13 sponge cake recipes, and there's lots of explanations on how to do this. You can like WhatsApp that number. I'm also going to leave a link. The book is on Amazon as well, so I'm going to leave a link on that. And we also have an online class if you want, more in-depth stuff as well. So make sure you get that sponge cake ebook. It's definitely worth it. Number 4 tip: know the different types of cakes. So as I encounter a lot of bakers, I noticed that there is stuff that people don't know. Hello. Hi, Raida. Rita? Raida or Masha. Hi. Thanks for joining me. Okay, so if you don't know this, there is different types of cakes based on mixing methods. And there is a video in this channel. If you're watching this later in the replay, I'm gonna, link this. But after watching this, guys, if you don't know, I'm gonna make sure you go to our playlist and check out types of cakes. There is 4 types of cakes mainly. There's many, by the way, guys. These are the main top ones, most common. Butter or oil cakes, most likely that's what you're baking. If you're a beginner or anyone can bake these. Sponge cakes, which is what I'm discussing today. Then baked flourless cakes and unbaked flourless cakes. These are like desserts and other stuff, right? And if you haven't, by the way, guys, subscribe. Make sure you hit that like button. It really helps. So make sure you know that there's 4 types of cakes, which leads me to tip number 5. Know the difference between butter cakes and sponge cakes. So the reason I put those two together is this. I'll meet people who don't know, one, that there is different types of cakes based on mixing methods. Most people think that the different types of cakes are like flavor, like marble and vanilla. No, those are flavors of cake. You can have a sponge cake that's a marble cake, and you can have a butter cake that's a marble cake. So those are flavors. I'm talking about types of cakes based on how they're mixed and the ingredients that they use. So number 4 is make sure you know that there's at least 4 main types. And then number 5, know the difference between the most popular ones, which are butter cakes, and then what I'm talking about, which is the sponge cakes. So that's what I want to get into. So what are butter cakes? What are butter or oil cakes? Like I said, I will link the video, but right now I'm going to go through it really quickly as to what they are. These are the most commonly known types of cakes, right? Most people who start baking or never go beyond that are most likely baking butter cakes. They usually contain fat in their ingredients, usually butter or margarine, and in some case, oil is used. They also, most of the time, use a chemical raising agent like baking powder or baking soda, right? So these are the most popular types of cakes. Most of them look like this, right? They are moist, they are fluffy most of the time, but they do tend to be a little heavier than sponge cakes, which are literally like a sponge, right? That's the texture of a sponge cake. So most of your butter cakes are gonna look like this, right? When it comes to sponge cakes, these cakes generally do not contain any type of fat. Now, there are some that do, but most of them do not contain butter or oil, right? And most of them, again, do not use chemical raising agents, right? They don't use baking powder, and they don't, only one uses baking powder and baking soda, and that's chiffon cake. But the other ones don't use, right? So the volume is actually achieved by whipping the egg whites and whole eggs, depending on the type of recipe you're working on, and they're combined using the whisking method, right? And this is why sponge cakes tend to be a little bit more difficult for people than butter cakes, because butter cakes, you got baking powder in it, you're good to go. Here, technique is actually what helps your cake rise. So realize if you get technique wrong, you're gonna probably deflate your cake, right? So you whisk those eggs until they're double in size or triple in size, and then you're gonna add other ingredients like maybe sugar to make your meringue. After that, you fold in your dry ingredients. Again, technique. If you deflate this batter, there's no baking powder. So if you fold in the wrong way, that's it. It starts deflating, right? So these cakes generally are able to rise due to the air that you've whipped into those eggs. And you can actually under whip and you can over whip. So you really want to get it correctly. So if you whip correctly and then you get the cake in there, the air that you created with that whipping is what expands in the oven and gives that sponge cake that rise that you're gonna need. So basically, the success of this method depends on your eggs not deflating, which means again, you can't over whip and you can't under whip. You gotta get it just right, which is why I say you need to practice this. And then remember, you're gonna add other stuff. You're gonna add sugar to make your meringue. You're gonna incorporate flour. You need to make sure it doesn't deflate, right? So you'll notice most recipes will say triple sift. Some people will sift 10 times or 5 times. This is because you want that flour so airy and light and just so soft that it doesn't deflate your batter, right? And so you really want to be careful. So if you note, there's a lot of being careful and good technique that comes to making sponge cakes, and you really want to be careful of that. Now, remember, when you fold the flour, you want to make sure you're not deflating that batter. And that's why a lot of the times sponge cakes are actually called foam batters. That's because you're going to add it. And if you listen, like when we're in class, we tell you to listen and we tell you to listen for that foam noise. When you mix up water and there's like this foam noise, you want to make sure your cake batter still has that foam noise so that we know that you've not lost that air and it hasn't deflated. Okay. Now, why do we not use fat in sponge cakes? Well, because with that foam batter, it's very light and you don't want it to deflate. So most of the time, it's going to weigh down that foam batter, and that's why most of the sponge cakes don't use oil or butter. But there is two that actually use. Chiffon cakes is one we call it like a sponge cake that cheats. So that one does use baking powder and it does have oil. And then there's the genoise or the genoise, however you want to say it. That sometimes, like I don't like adding butter in it because it does tend to deflate, but you do not have to add butter on that, right? Now, the thing about this you have to know is this, and that's why I like people to know the difference. Because your sponge cake is not going to be having this butter, and I think only one sponge cake has a milk, which is chiffon cake. Realize that these sponge cakes tend to have a little less flavor, a little less. I'm not saying they're flavorless, they have a little less flavor, and they're not as moist as butter cakes because there's no fat, there's no milk. Maybe there's just the flavor and then the eggs and the sugar and the flour, right? So you realize that they're gonna be dry, which is most of the time you note people will moisten the sponge cakes because literally the reason why it's called a sponge, it's like a sponge. It has a lot of air and may not taste very good. Like a vanilla sponge cake has even almost an eggy smell to it, unless you had a lot of flavor. So you do want to realize that they do tend to be dry. So people moisten them before you assemble them into a black forest, a white forest, a Fraser cake, whatever it is that you're doing. Now, again, sponge cakes themselves are broken down into categories. I will not be going into that because I do have a video that I'm going to link onto the types of sponge cakes that I've done in this channel. But please notice that sponge cake, again, is an overall type of cake. And then there's different ones. There's the genoise, there's the chiffon, there's angel food cake. There's a biscuit, and I literally have the recipe book has a recipe of each when it comes to that, right? And the method and the recipe and the ingredients and all that. So if you want that, get the ebook. So basically, if you learn how to correctly mix, bake, and everything, these are the type of results you should be using. So on the left, that is a biscuit. That means this cake has no baking powder. This was whipped correctly. This is literally a result from one of our students who did this chocolate sponge cake, and it came out like this. It sunk a little bit in the middle, but it was very good. And on the right, you'll see a chiffon cake. That is one of the chiffon cakes from our chiffon cake brand where we sell these sponge cakes. So if you do it correctly, these are the type of results you should be getting. Very moist, fluffy, and they get a lot of height, this is how your sponge cakes should be coming out. So those are the tips I have. What I want to do is I want to share some of the things people get wrong, like the two of the main troubleshooting challenges that most people, we get them in class, and most people DM like, this happened, what do I do? And number one is when your cake sinks in the center. And when I started, this was happening to me all the time when it comes to sponge cakes. And it usually happens, number one, technique. You overbeat the batter. And when you overbeat it, you lose that air, right? And so you don't want that happening because it's going to sink. Second thing people do is that they open the door oven during baking, especially the first 20 to 25 minutes, which are very crucial. So you want to make sure you're not doing that because you need that sponge cake to rise nicely without any disturbance. So if your recipe tells you 30 to 40 minutes, only open that oven from the 30-minute mark because it means from that time it is safe to actually open, right? So don't over whisk, don't under whisk, don't overfold, don't underfold. Okay, so you have to practice that. And another thing, if your oven is too hot, your sponge cake will also sink. The other thing is dry cakes. Now, I know this is almost ironic because I just said that sponge cakes are dry. They are. But then now they're not too dry. So that's the other thing. If you have very dry sponge cakes, something is wrong. Okay. And especially if you tell me you have a dry chiffon cake, something is wrong for sure because chiffon cakes are not dry. Now, a biscuit could be dry, but it can't be too dry, right? So this caused again by over baking. This means you bake too long. Like it's at 30 to 40 minutes, and you're like, no, let me go 45 minutes. Or maybe your oven runs hot and by the 35-minute mark, your cake was actually done. So you want to make sure that you're checking your oven to avoid overbaking. Second thing that happens is the wrong ratio of ingredients. So most of the time, this means you have a bad recipe. Maybe there's not enough of something or there's too much of something. If there's too much of flour, something like that. So you want to make sure that you have the right a tried and tested recipes like ours so that you make sure you actually correctly mixing your ingredients and measuring your ingredients, right? So make sure you use the minimum baking time given. If you're told 30 to 35, 30-minute mark, check that sponge cake, insert the skewer or whatever, make sure it's coming out clean. Don't leave it in there if it's ready. Just remove it at that time, right? So again, sponge cakes do tend to be dry, but they shouldn't be too dry. Okay, shouldn't be something that's so dry I can tell it's very dry. Now again, the irony. This happens if your oven is too hot. So this is why I'm always telling people, please have a high temperature thermometer because if you don't, this is what happens, right? Your sponge cake does tend to dry a lot, right? So I hope this has been helpful. Do comment below. Has this been helpful? I hope this has helped you guys out to kind of figure out what's happening with sponge cakes. If you are struggling with sponge cakes and you have a specific thing that has happened to your sponge cake and you want to ask, feel free to comment, even if it's not right now. I will answer the question because I know that tends to be a very, very tricky topic for people. And just a reminder, please get the ebook if you don't already have it. I'm going to have details at the bottom and a link for the WhatsApp. And we also have an online class if you want to really get in depth and learn exactly how to make those sponge cakes. And by the way, we do periodically have sponge cake classes in Nairobi, Kenya. So if we do, we're definitely going to link the link for the class at the bottom. We don't currently have one. Maybe in March we're going to be having one. So for sure. All right. So I'm going to wait 1 minute to see if anybody has a question and then I can slowly sort of, I see Wangoi has a question. I'm glad to hear this is helpful. Awesome. Where can I get a high temperature thermometer? Top Serve Limited. So we get most of our stuff from Top Serve Limited, TOPSERVE. Top Serve Limited. They actually sell a lot of cake supply things, so you definitely want to check them out. They sell more than Top Serve. I'm trying to get it so that so you can see it. So Wanjiko, I hope Wangui, Wanjohi, I hope that you check them out. There you go. They sell a lot of stuff, and I think that their small thermometer is not is like 450 or 500 shillings, and so you should be able to get it. Please get it. Like that for me is a game changer. Every time if I get another oven, always buy a thermometer for it because it's very important. Okay. Well, I don't see anybody with another question. Thank you so much, guys, for hanging out with me. Please do leave a comment, hit them love bubbles or a like button. Let me know if this helps and if I should do more of this content, like explaining how things work, like sponge cakes. I can do maybe butter cakes next time. If you guys are interested in that, just let me know. So yeah, if you're in Kenya, have a lovely evening, and I will see you guys in the next video. I'm gonna leave a link for the next video, and it's gonna be about sponge cake. So make sure if you haven't watched that in this channel of ours, make sure you watch the next video on the various types of sponge cakes. This might help you, and it might come in handy for you. All right. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys, and commenting, and I will see you next time. Bye. Oh, Wango, I've seen your comment. Please do butter cakes. I will. I will. Promise. Okay, cool. Okay, awesome. All right, good. When I know you guys are interested in this, then I'm able to do it. So I will definitely do it. All right, guys.